not every call comes from the land, and there are voices that the sea never returns. Hello, my friends. Before we dive into madness and daydreams, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, okay? And remember to like and subscribe to the channel. Few travelers chose Dunwich on the Cliffs as their destination, and those who did not usually return with encouraging tales. It was a craggy village, set against razor-sharp cliffs, where the wind whistled like an ancient lament, and the seagulls seemed more like watchmen than birds. Thomas Gray stepped off the bus in a thick drizzle, his overcoat already damp and his hat soaked through within minutes. The mist hugged the road like a living cloak, and the eyes of the fishermen watching him from the nearest pub conveyed more than distrust. There was a veiled fear, the uneasiness of those who read omens in every stranger's step. Another one who comes and doesn't listen to the signs, someone muttered under his breath, before disappearing into the smoke of his pipe. Thomas, a former soldier hardened by war and loss, now a detective working for a London insurance company, had come to investigate the disappearance of 3 young women who had been officially reported as having drowned. But the absence of bodies and the rumors surrounding the decommissioned lighthouse led him to suspect that there was more to the story than accidental drownings. The name of the lighthouse, Hollow Bay, came up in every report, in every whispered exchange at the police station. But when he got to the town, no one seemed willing to talk about it. Thomas tried to talk to the local sheriff, a surly man named Wilfred Ponsby, who greeted him with a mixture of forced politeness and palpable irritation. "There's nothing but treacherous seas and the carelessness of dreamy girls," Ponsby had said before slamming the door to his office. The detective, however, could read between the lines. There was fear in the sheriff's words, and perhaps even guilt. Every time he mentioned the lighthouse, faces changed, eyes averted. At the cafe in the square, a lady in a flowered apron actually dropped her china cup when he asked about the voices in the water. "You'd better not listen to such things," she had said quietly, her eyes wide as if she had heard too much. Thomas made a mental note of everything, but his expression remained impassive. He was a man who had lost his wife in a bombing in 1944 in London, and since then he carried in his eyes the shadow of someone who no longer fears even the dead, let alone the living. It was in the isolated wing of the local sanatorium, among the acrid-smelling corridors and walls yellowed by humidity, that Thomas found the only concrete clue: Eleanor Marsh, the survivor. The doctors knew little about what had happened the night she fled the lighthouse, but they reported that she had not spoken a single word since then. Her eyes seemed always fixed on something that was not there, and her hands, thin, fragile, restless, did not stop drawing. Crooked spirals, 5-pointed stars with deformed vertices, shapes that resembled tentacles or roots plunged into abysses. "She is lost within herself," Dr. Hargrove explained, as if speaking of an unsolvable enigma. But Thomas saw something else. He saw a gleam in the young woman's eyes that did not match madness. It was more like lucid fear, a panic that knew exactly what it feared. That afternoon, when he approached the stretcher on which Eleanor was drawing, she did not move away. She just handed him one of the papers, where a central spiral ended in eyes. "What did you see there, Eleanor?" he asked, and for the first time, she looked directly at him. In the days that followed, Thomas visited Eleanor every day, bringing her books, tea, and new sketchbooks. There was a sweet melancholy about her, a fragility that contrasted sharply with the horrific symbols he sketched. Sometimes he would talk about the war, about London, about his lost wife, and although she did not respond, she listened with reverent attention. The connection between them grew, silent, made of gestures, glances, and their mutual presence. One night, with a sharp breeze, Thomas left the sanatorium later than usual, and as he turned the corner of the garden, he saw a white silhouette on the cliffs. It was Eleanor, in her nightgown, standing on the edge of the precipice, her hair blowing in the wind. Thomas ran to her, but before he could say anything, she turned and walked slowly back, as if nothing had happened. "She hears something outside," he murmured to himself, feeling for the first time an involuntary shiver down his spine. Each night, Thomas noticed that Eleanor was moving closer to the edge of the cliffs, as if drawn by an invisible hypnotic force. It was as if something was calling her, as if the wind carried a melody that was inaudible to him, but perfectly clear to her. One day, intrigued, he followed her discreetly to the top of the cliff. The sky was covered in grey clouds, and the sea below was crashing against the rocks with an ancient fury. Eleanor stood there for long minutes, motionless, her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sea and the sky merged into a greenish haze. Thomas got close enough to hear a murmur coming from her. It was not clear speech, but a guttural, rhythmic whisper, almost like a prayer. "Eleanor!" he called in a low voice, afraid of frightening her. She turned, slowly, and for a brief moment, just a moment, her eyes seemed to reflect the ocean itself, deep, shifting, as if they contained something beyond human comprehension. That night, Thomas could not sleep. His dreams were filled with raging seas, songs in extinct languages, and eyes everywhere, always watching. Thomas's restlessness led him to the village library, a dusty, unkempt building where only an elderly librarian remained, dozing among shelves that smelled of mildew and salt. There, among old newspapers and church records, Thomas found mention of the Hollow Bay Lighthouse. A 1924 article, clipped from a local newspaper, reported that the lighthouse had closed after the death of its keeper, Harold Marsh, Eleanor's surname. The article said that Marsh had gone mad, shouted nonsense for a week, and finally thrown himself from the top of the tower during a storm. There was no wake and no known burial. His body was never found, read the last line of the article, underlined by hand. Thomas leafed through other records and discovered that the priest at the time had also left the village shortly thereafter without explanation. Even more disturbing were the copies of letters Marsh had left behind, scrawled in shaky, nearly illegible handwriting, filled with references to the voice from the sea, eyes in the deep, and the chosen one will come with the blood of the guardian. Thomas frowned. Was this all just the ravings of a madman, or a warning no one would heed? Connections began to form in the detective's mind like pieces of a dank, jagged jigsaw puzzle. Eleanor was a direct descendant of Harold Marsh. She was not just a survivor, she was a living link to the village's dark past. Thomas sought out the current vicar, a pale, elusive man named Reverend Clemens, and asked for access to the church archives. "These things are not for prying eyes," the vicar said, clasping his thin hands in his lap. But Thomas insisted, showing his badge and claiming that lives were at stake. Reluctantly, Clemens led him to a locked room at the back of the church, where Latin books, ancient maps, and objects covered in black cloths slept in the dark. There, among the baptismal and marriage records, was Eleanor's birth certificate, confirming the relationship. But what caught Thomas's eye was a yellowed notebook hidden beneath a missal. In it were descriptions of ancient rituals, performed by those who came before the priests, and frequent mentions of an entity called Inthaleg. The texts spoke of the deep that breathes, of sacrifices to maintain eternal sleep, and of brides sealed with blood and sea. That night, disturbed by his discoveries, Thomas walked through the village, trying to clear his head. As he passed through an alley between the butcher's shop and the tavern, he heard hurried footsteps and muffled whispers. He decided to follow the trail of murmurs to a slope that led to the beach, hidden among rocks and bushes. There, amid the darkness dotted with torches, he saw a group of villagers, men and women who during the day seemed harmless, gathered around a circle of ancient stones. They wore dark robes, and their faces were covered by crude masks, carved in wood with deformed features, resembling fish or octopuses. They murmured incomprehensible words in a low and constant cadence, like a chant. In the center of the circle, there was a symbol drawn in the sand, Eleanor's spiral. Thomas's blood ran cold in his veins. This was no fisherman's superstition. It was a cult, a living, breathing cult that hid something terrible beneath the facade of that sleepy village. He backed away slowly, but before he could disappear into the darkness, he saw a slight figure standing in the distance, watching the ceremony. Eleanor. She wasn't with them, but she didn't seem surprised either. The morning after the ritual on the beach, Thomas awoke with a persistent feeling of nausea, as if the very air of the village was saturated with salt and decay. The murmuring chant still echoed in his mind, distorted even after hours of silent vigil. Determined to confront the reality unfolding before him, he sought out Eleanor at the sanatorium, but this time he found her restless, pacing in circles, her eyes fixed on something he could not see. When he entered, she stopped suddenly, picked up a piece of paper, and scribbled with trembling hands a new drawing. An altar in front of a sort of crypt, surrounded by columns covered in slime and algae. Thomas recognized the shapes. The architecture reminded him of the oldest part of the abandoned church on the outskirts of the village, a medieval building long forgotten by the faithful. Eleanor clutched the paper tightly, and with a troubled look, pointed to the drawing, then to him as if to say, "You have to see it." Without saying a word, Thomas nodded, and that night they both left in secret. Under the veil of a moonless sky, the church was a grim monolith in the middle of the countryside, made of dark stone and covered in thick ivy, as if nature itself were trying to erase it from existence. As she pushed open the heavy doors, the creak resounded like a forgotten lament. In the main altar, covered in dust and faded Christian symbols, there was a hole under a threadbare carpet. Eleanor pointed with her gaze. Thomas pulled back the cloth to reveal a rusty iron hatch marked with the same spiral symbol she had drawn so often. With effort, he opened it, revealing narrow steps that descended into a living, pulsating darkness. Armed only with a lantern and his remaining courage, he descended. The walls of the crypt were covered in archaic inscriptions, many of them similar to the texts he had read in the church archives. In its center was indeed an altar, but this one was not made for Christian worship. It was made of black stone, adorned with bones, shells, and objects that were impossible to identify. Melted candles still burned, as if someone had been there recently. On the walls, hybrid creatures, half human, half sea, seemed to move as the light touched them. Eleanor held Thomas's arm tightly, and for the first time he felt her tremble. "Who are they?" Thomas whispered, more to himself than to Eleanor. And as if in answer, a figure emerged from the shadows behind the altar. It was Reverend Clemens, dressed in a dark robe and holding a small fur-covered book. "You have seen too much," he said, his voice calm and devoid of any trace of emotion. Eleanor took a step back, but Thomas stepped between her and the vicar. "What is this? A cult? A sect of lunatics?" Clemens sighed as if lamenting the ignorance of the others. "Not lunatics, Mr. Gray. Guardians. We have kept his sleep steady for centuries. Eleanor should not have escaped the call, but now it is close." Thomas stepped forward, but before he could touch him, the vicar disappeared into the shadows to the side, as if he knew hidden passages. They left with their hearts racing, fear pulsing in their temples. On the way out, Eleanor wrote in Thomas's notebook, "If he takes me, you must forget." But Thomas could not. Something deeper had been awakened within him. Not just the need for justice, but a primal instinct to protect. In the days that followed, Thomas watched over Eleanor like a tortured angel. He slept badly, with dreams of underwater chambers and lights that rotated underwater like eyes that never closed. He also began to notice that the villagers were watching him with increasing hostility. In the market, he felt silent glances that would look away as soon as he returned them. Children stopped playing when they saw him pass by, and at night, footsteps could be heard outside his inn, even when no one was in sight. Everything seemed to conspire against reason. And then, one grey afternoon, Eleanor surprised him by writing, "If I love you, I may not come back." What could have been a moment of absolute tenderness was imbued with pain. Thomas did not respond with words. He simply took her in his arms and kissed her, as if with that gesture he could chase away the approaching abysses. But Eleanor wept silently, with the certainty of someone who loves on the edge of the abyss. That night, he found a letter in his backpack, written in her fragile handwriting. It read, "Something is watching me, Thomas. When I close my eyes, it's there, and it's calling to me." Thomas read Eleanor's letter over and over that night, until the words seemed to leap off the page with a life of their own. Something about her, her restrained fear, her involuntary surrender, made him feel uneasy beyond compassion. It was as if she were already half gone, as if part of his soul had been dragged to another plane, where only the whispers of the depths could reach. He tried to sleep, but the images would not leave him. He dreamed of underwater caverns, where endless staircases descended toward the center of the world, and where colossal eyes slowly opened like nightmare flowers. He woke sweating, with his ears ringing and the smell of the sea lingering on his pillow. Looking out the window, he saw Eleanor standing on the nearby hill, her white nightgown fluttering against the overcast sky. He hurried out of the inn and caught up with her. She did not speak, only handed him another drawing, a man surrounded by shadows, with tentacles coming out of his eyes. In the background, the lighthouse. "Do they see you now, too?" he asked, his voice almost faint. Eleanor nodded slowly and held his hand so tightly that he felt their bones meet. Thomas knew he needed answers, and they wouldn't come from police reports or church books. He returned to the abandoned church at dusk, alone this time, determined to explore the hidden tunnels further. He took a powerful flashlight, a revolver, and Eleanor's notebook. The silence inside was almost solid, broken only by the echo of his own footsteps. The crypt seemed larger than it had been the last time, as if it had expanded, or as if he had entered a different part, hidden by ancient mechanisms. In a side wall, he found a semicircular opening, where the smell of salt and decay was unbearable. He entered anyway, driven by a compulsion he didn't understand. At the end of the corridor, he found a rounded room, like a ritual chamber. In the center, a pedestal held a book, bound in darkened leather, with a symbol engraved on the cover, Eleanor's spiral, surrounded by eyes. It was De Profundis Nigrum. Thomas opened it and immediately felt a ringing in his ears. The pages were written in dead languages, but the symbols seemed to communicate something directly to his mind. Sacrifices, marriages, hybridizations. The word Yinthaleg appeared several times, accompanied by illustrations of creatures of incomprehensible proportions emerging from the sea to join human figures. Thomas felt sick. What was this? He staggered out of the crypt as if drunk, and the whole walk back to the village, the world, seemed slightly distorted. Colors were more saturated, sounds were muffled, and people's faces seemed like fleeting blurs. It was as if he had crossed an invisible threshold and was now between two worlds, the tangible and the unfathomable. When he reached the sanatorium, he found Eleanor sitting by the window, staring out at the sea with eyes that were calmer than usual. She turned when she saw him, and without hesitation she wrote, "Now you see." Thomas sat down beside her, took her hand gently, and replied, "I won't let them take you." Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder, as if she had known that the promise would be difficult to keep. He wanted to save her, but against what? Against an entire village, an ancestral cult, a mythological creature whose name she could not even pronounce without feeling her tongue tingle. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Dr. Hargrove. "Mr. Gray, we found something in the hospital archives, a diary of the old priest, which had been mistakenly stored with us." Thomas opened the diary with trembling hands, and there, among the words of Old English and poorly translated Latin, was the prophecy. "The last bride will open the eyes of the abyss, and he will awaken on the day of the third high tide eclipse." The next morning, the village awoke to a silent turmoil. No fishermen had gone out to sea, and the streets were deserted, as if everyone had sensed something. Thomas, journal in hand, crossed the square to the library again, determined to confirm the prophecy. He consulted nautical almanacs, lunar calendars, and astronomical records. And then he saw that night would coincide with the third partial eclipse of high tide, a rare phenomenon, recorded only twice in the last few decades. This was no coincidence. It was the culmination of an ancient plan. The prophecy was not just symbolic. It was a countdown, a warning. The last bride was Eleanor, and if Thomas did not do something, she would be taken, not by human hands, but by forces that had lurked beneath the waves since a time when the earth was still learning to breathe. As he left the library, something stopped him cold, a sound that came from nowhere. A deep guttural chant that seemed to resonate directly inside his skull. It was not a delirium. Others in the village also stopped, stunned, as if they had heard the same thing. The call had begun, and the sea was responding. From that afternoon on, Dunwich on the cliffs no longer disguised its nature. The masks had fallen, not from their faces, but from their attitudes. The locals no longer tried to feign ignorance. Fishermen who had previously avoided contact now stared at him with dull eyes, as if they were bodies inhabited by the will of others. When he entered the local tavern to seek news, he was greeted with a silence as oppressive as that of the deep sea. An elderly woman was compulsively cleaning glasses, while men sitting at tables seemed to be awaiting an order that hung in the air. "It's almost here," one of them murmured, as if to himself, and Thomas, as he tried to get closer, saw the man's fingers trace the spiral on the wood of the table, over and over, like a nervous tick. This was not collective madness. It was obedience to something greater, something that gave meaning to lives marked by loss, treacherous seas, and secrets rooted like seaweed deep in their souls. Thomas walked away feeling like he was being watched, and when he looked up, he saw children drawing spirals on the walls with charcoal. They've already accepted the end, he thought with a shiver. With no time to waste, Thomas gathered together everything he had: Eleanor's drawings, De Profundis Nigrum, the priest's diary, and the letter in which she spoke of love and the fear of never returning. He decided he would go to the lighthouse, the center of it all, the place where Harold Marsh, Eleanor's ancestor, had gone mad and thrown himself into the water, the place that for years had been avoided as if it contained a fissure between this world and another, older, hungrier one. Eleanor, upon hearing of his decision, did not protest. Instead, she wrote, "If you go, do not go alone." And it was she who led him to a hidden path between cliffs, overgrown with seagrass and the bones of seagulls. The lighthouse loomed out of the mist like a spectral tower, cracked by time but still standing, a monolith from another age. As they approached, the wind seemed to cease, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The windows were black, and the door was broken, as if it had been used recently. As Thomas crossed the threshold, he felt something familiar. Not the lighthouse itself, but the presence emanating from it, as if he were entering the interior of a sleeping being, passing through its fossilized ribs and lungs. The interior was damp, saturated with mud and salt. The once white walls were covered in symbols carved with knives, repeated hundreds of times. Spirals, open eyes, faceless mouths. Eleanor walked ahead, as if guided by an ancient memory. Thomas tried to reach her, but his flashlight began to flicker, and with each failure of light, the walls seemed to shift. Stairs appeared where doors had been, windows disappeared. Was it the lighthouse, or was his mind giving in? At the top of the tower, they found what remained of the old sanctuary, a circular room, with windows opening onto the sea, and a circle of stones in the center, where bones and seaweed had been arranged in a ritual pattern. In the center, a pedestal. Eleanor knelt before it and then spoke for the first time since the incident. "He's waking up." Her voice was soft but filled with terror. Thomas ran to her, knelt beside her. "You don't have to go. I'll get you out of here. We'll escape." She just shook her head. "There's no escape, Thomas. It's inside me, just like it was inside my grandfather. The call isn't a sound, it's a bond." At that moment, the lower gates of the lighthouse burst open. Voices rose from the darkness, guttural chants that spiraled up the stairs like a choir of drowning men. Thomas reached for his gun, but Eleanor held him steady. "They are not the danger. They are only instruments." From the top of the tower, they saw hooded figures surrounding the base of the lighthouse. The tide was rising unnaturally, swallowing up the sand and rocks at a furious pace. And then a greenish light appeared from the sea, a light that came not from the sky but from the depths, as if something colossal were moving below. Thomas desperately tried to pull Eleanor away, but she wrenched him away and advanced toward the center of the circle. The chanting grew louder, the stones vibrated, and the tower itself seemed to pulse with the rhythm of an abyssal heart. "You loved me, and that's why you will live," she said, tears in her eyes before an aura enveloped her and lifted her off her feet. "No!" Thomas screamed, running toward her, but an invisible force threw him against the wall. Eleanor turned one last time. "Run!" The greenish light that was pouring out of the sea was not just light, it was consciousness, a kind of awareness that invaded the eyes, the mind, and the body, like an intrusive, indifferent presence. Thomas, still slumped against the wall of the lighthouse, tried to stand, but the ground shook, and a deep sound, not a rumble, but a pulsation, rose through the stones of the tower. It was as if the structure itself were breathing. Outside, the sea bubbled, and impossible shapes emerged from the foam, tentacles as wide as shipmasts, covered in eyes that blinked in unison, rising and falling from the waves as if testing the limits of the physical world. The chants had become screams, not of pain, but of ecstasy. The cultists danced around the lighthouse, some tearing off their clothes, others kneeling before the water like children before a father returning from a 1,000-year exile. Eleanor, in the center of the circle of bones, held her arms outstretched, her hair flowing like underwater seaweed, her eyes glazed over in the light. Thomas managed to crawl toward her, but an invisible force surrounded him like a bubble of heavy air. He screamed her name, but the sound died in the air, drowned out by ancient voices. Reality began to shatter. The lighthouse windows showed images that did not belong there. Sunken cities with cyclopean towers, creatures that walked under the sea with shapes that defied logic, and a throne of black coral where a gigantic figure, half octopus, half dream, slowly rose. Thomas saw these visions not with his eyes, but with his mind. He felt his thoughts being forced to expand beyond human limits, like an accordion stretched to the breaking point. The words of the book he had read seemed to be recited now inside his head by overlapping dissonant voices that came from within and without. Inthaleg, the bridegroom of the abyss, he who waits in the belly of the water for the touch of his chosen bride. Thomas tried to resist. He tried to think of Eleanor, of the promise he had made, of the kiss they had shared. But even that feeling was beginning to be contaminated. Love was turning to fear, and fear, madness. "Come back to me," he shouted, his throat torn. "Fight! Remember me!" Eleanor blinked. For the first time in minutes, she seemed to react. Her lips moved as if to respond. "Thomas," she said, her voice so weak it barely carried through the vibration-soaked air. Then something changed. The tentacles rose higher toward the lighthouse. The rocks vibrated so strongly that chunks of the tower began to break away. Cultists ran in circles, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying. Some dove into the sea, arms outstretched, and were swallowed without resistance. Eleanor looked toward the light and hesitated for a moment. Tears streamed down her face. Then she screamed, a real human fierce scream, "Run!" That broke the spell. Thomas felt the bubble dissipate, and in a burst of desperation, he ran toward it. But before he could reach it, the light grew, not in brightness, but in presence. A glare that did not illuminate, only blotted out everything around it. He felt his bones vibrate, his heart stop, and time stop too. Eleanor was enveloped by a liquid mist, suspended in the air, and the tentacles surrounded her like an inhuman embrace. She closed her eyes. "I love you," she murmured, and disappeared. The last thing Thomas saw was the sea spiraling outward like a cosmic whirlpool. The lighthouse tower began to collapse in on itself, pulled by forces that obeyed no earthly laws. He fell through one of the windows, crashing against the rocks and rolling down the slope until he hit the sodden sand. When he opened his eyes, everything was dark. Silence. No sound except his breathing. The village, gone. There was no lighthouse, no beach. Dunwich on the cliffs had been wiped off the map like a charcoal line on wet paper. Thomas struggled to his feet, his body covered in blood and salt. The sky was clear, cloudless, and on the horizon only the sea, serene, silent, as if nothing had happened. But inside him, the chaos still screamed. Inside his mind, the spiral spun around and around. It was weeks before Thomas was seen again. A lone fisherman in a cove miles from Dunwich found him wandering the beach, covered in crusts of salt and dried blood, his eyes as empty as fogged mirrors. He repeated incoherent words, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in languages that even the doctors could not identify. He was taken to a hospital in Dover, and from there transferred to a psychiatric asylum in London, a tall grey building like a vertical tomb, where the windows were for observation rather than light. Thomas did not resist questioning, not because he was hiding anything, but because he no longer knew how to translate what he had witnessed. His accounts of a swallowed-up village, tentacles in the sea, a woman who merged with the ocean foam, and an ancient cult that invoked underwater gods. All of this was written off as traumatic delirium. No physical evidence had been found. No village called Dunwich on the Cliffs appeared on recent maps. The insurance company's records had disappeared. Eleanor Marsh had never existed in the records of the hospital or the local parish. It was as if all reality around the truth had been erased, corroded by forces that also consumed her mind. In the white, padded cell where he was locked, Thomas spent his days drawing. He used bits of charcoal, breadcrumbs, even dried blood, spirals, black stars, circles of stones and eyes, always eyes. The nurses tried to remove the drawings, but he would redo them with an unhealthy obsession. He spoke to no one except during his nighttime outbursts, when he would wake up shouting incoherent words like, "Inthaleg, the bride has arrived. He is dreaming of me now." The attending psychiatrist, Dr. Bertram Holloway, wrote in his report, "The patient presents with structured delusions with mythomania, associated with post-traumatic stress disorder and possible underlying schizophrenia. He refuses intervention, but seems fully convinced of the reality of his hallucinations." But there were moments, rare but increasingly frequent, when Thomas would laugh. A subtle laugh, sometimes muffled, sometimes wide open, as if he knew something that no one else did, as if he had become the herald of a secret as old as the sea, and as useless to tell as a song sung by fish in unfathomable depths. The other patients began to avoid him, not because they were afraid of him, but because they said that at night strange sounds came from his cell, like running water, like bubbles bursting, like voices that didn't pass through walls, but through the doors of the mind. One of them tried to share a room with Thomas for a night, a former math teacher who had been hospitalized for auditory hallucinations. The next day, the man had drawn a detailed map of a submerged city in his own blood and thrown himself down the main staircase. Thomas had watched it all in silence. He had simply observed, as if watching the pieces of a much larger game move by themselves. "He heard," he said quietly to the nurse, who froze at the words. The psychiatric ward where he was being held was sealed off. The director of the asylum considered transferring him, but no other hospital would accept him without a more thorough clinical evaluation. "This man is not crazy. He is contaminated," one of the attendants wrote in an internal note before resigning. Little by little, Thomas's presence became unbearable for everyone, not because of the violence, but because of the feeling that something or someone inhabited the space with him. It was a rainy morning in March when Thomas was visited by a priest, a young seminarian who claimed to have read parts of De Profundis Nigrum preserved by an antiquarian in Scotland. The meeting lasted 20 minutes. At the end, the priest left the asylum in complete silence, his face pale and his lips trembling. A month later, he was found dead on the Thames docks, his clothes caked with mud and sea sand in his lungs. The police report found no explanation, no evidence of drowning, no sign of a struggle. But Thomas knew. He had always known. With each new strange death, he added another line to his drawings, a line in the spiral, a step down the staircase. His eyes no longer sought contact with others. They looked beyond, inward, to the place where Eleanor still whispered his name. Because she had not died. She had been taken, and yet she still loved him. He heard her voice in the bathwater, in the sound of the plumbing, in the whisper of the sheets as the wind passed through the cracks in the cell. I didn't come back, but I still love you. That was always how the whisper ended, and that was always how Thomas's smile was born. Time had lost its meaning for Thomas. The days dragged on, the same, but he could tell the tides without looking out the window. He could feel them in his body, in his bones, in the rhythm of his own blood. When the tide rose, he laughed. When it fell, he cried. The doctors treated him like a case study, a mental fossil of a mind consumed by war and the delirium of grief. But in the early hours of the morning, when the entire hospital was asleep, Thomas would hear footsteps in the hallways. Not the nurses, but wet feet shuffling across the cold linoleum, and with them came the smell. Sea air, rotting seaweed, salt and sulfur. Sometimes the lights in the ward would flicker. Other times Thomas himself would leave his cell, not to escape, but to overflow. It was as if his consciousness were projecting itself, fluid as ocean water, through cracks and pipes, crossing walls, spreading echoes of what he had witnessed. A male nurse swore he heard a female voice in the ladies' room at 3 a.m., singing a song in a language he didn't recognize. When he described the melody, Thomas smiled. It was the wedding song. He's awake now, but he still dreams of me. Dr. Holloway, fascinated and disturbed at the same time, requested a new neurological evaluation. During the EEG, the technicians detected electrical patterns never before recorded. Rhythmic, spiral-shaped patterns with intervals that seemed to echo. Pulses. When they sped up, Thomas sweated. When they slowed down, he groaned as if something was missing. At one point, the device's tracing formed a shape similar to the black star that Thomas had been compulsively drawing. The technician who operated the equipment resigned that same day, alleging visions of eyes on the monitor screen. The files were lost. The room was sealed. But Thomas didn't need machines to know. The connection was still there. Eleanor, or what was left of her, was still there. She was part of something larger, incomprehensible, but for some reason, she still remembered him. It's what saves me from dissolution, he once wrote on toilet paper with the charcoal from a burnt loaf of bread. She anchors me. I am no longer a man. I am a witness. I am the scar of a cosmic birth. In the psychiatric ward, other patients began to show similar symptoms. Water delirium, unlisted languages, dreams of stairs descending beneath the English Channel. A blind man began to write poems in archaic Gaelic about the bride dressed in shells and blood. A nurse committed suicide after drawing a map on her skin with a stylus that matched the reefs off Dunwich. Reefs that, according to current maps, no longer exist. The hospital management tried to cover up the incidents, but rumors spread. Investigative journalists began to circulate undercover within the walls. One of them, trying to interview Thomas, ran out of his cell, shouting that he had heard a child calling for him from inside the wall. 3 days later, he was found dead in his bathtub, suffocated by tentacles drawn in pen on his skin. No real substance in his system. The coroner called it induced psychosis. But Thomas knew the truth. It was the echo of the abyss, the trail of the engagement that was sealed with blood, love, and sea. And so the weeks became months, and the months an unnameable time. Thomas no longer counted the days. He sat every evening before the window of his cell, watching the grey skyline of London, where the heavy clouds always seemed to come from the south, like veils dragged by invisible hands. He smiled. Sometimes he cried. Always he listened. He heard Eleanor in every drop of rain, in every creak of the pipes, in every deep silence that stretched beyond what was acceptable. She said, "I haven't come back, but I still love you." And that was what kept Thomas alive. Not for sanity, but for surrender. Because while most men go mad when they touch the unnameable, he loved it. And what is love if not the deepest form of madness? One morning, as Thomas was being taken for a supervised bath, he stood before a fogged-up mirror and didn't recognize his own reflection. The image was there, yes, his thin body, his sunken eyes, his hair too grey for his age. But it wasn't just him. Behind his eyes there was something else, a vastness, a seabed that moved as if it were alive, breathing inside him. He touched the glass with the palm of his hand, and for an instant he swore he saw Eleanor behind him, naked, covered only by strands of seaweed and blackened pearls, whispering soundless words. When he blinked, she was gone, but the touch had left its mark. The mirror had formed a spiral of condensation, even though his finger hadn't drawn it. The nurses ignored the detail, as they always did. Mr. Gray is in an advanced state of psychotic deterioration, they noted in their reports. But no medication had worked. No amount of analysis could explain the intermittent lucidity with which Thomas described places that no longer existed or had never existed in absurd detail. The slippery stones of an underwater altar, mosaics made of scales and volcanic glass, walls adorned with the bones of nameless creatures. He remembered it all, not as memory, but as inheritance. On the night of the spring equinox, Thomas had a fit of euphoria. He was found standing on his bed, softly singing a three-note melody that repeated in a loop. It was hypnotic, almost childlike, but for some reason, all the nurses who heard it became ill. One of them vomited blood and asked to be transferred. Another had a seizure. Thomas was restrained, sedated, and held in isolation for 3 days. When he returned to his common cell, he was silent, but something had changed. His drawings had stopped. He no longer drew spirals, eyes, or stars. He just waited. He sat with his back to the door, staring at the wall. In the last psychiatric report, Dr. Holloway wrote, "Patient has entered a selective catatonic state, unresponsive to external stimuli. However, his heart rate and brain activity have increased. He is waiting. Waiting for what? No one knew. But there was something in Thomas's eyes, even when they were still, that gave the impression that he had already seen the end, and perhaps the next beginning. It was during a routine inspection that a new employee found, under Thomas's mattress, a letter written with almost calligraphic precision. It was addressed to no one, but it recounted in detail the rise of a submerged village. It spoke of Dunwich on the Cliffs as if it still existed, describing its stone houses, its inhabitants with glassy eyes and cold hands, and the lighthouse tower now covered in black coral and candles that never go out. At the end of the letter, a sentence sent shivers down the reader's spine. "She sings for me every night. When he truly wakes, the world will be one. Sea and mind, abyss and love." The letter was filed away as literary delirium. But years later, when the tides began to alter their cycle for no meteorological reason, when fishermen in Dover reported of female voices coming from the water, when tourists disappeared without a trace on once safe beaches, someone remembered the story. But it was too late. The maps had begun to change. Thomas remained there, in cell number 43, for another 6 years. Time did not touch him the way it did the other patients. He did not age as quickly. His skin seemed colder every month, but never cadaverous. The doctors gave up trying to explain it. They said his body had assumed a kind of homeostasis that was indifferent to normal biology. But some, in particular, were beginning to believe it, even if they would never admit it out loud. Because when they looked at Thomas for too long, they felt dizzy. They felt as if they were being pulled by a gaze that came from within their flesh, as if they were facing an opening to the ocean in the middle of London. He no longer spoke, but he smiled, a light smile full of tenderness and compassion, as if he knew that one day everyone would understand, not by choice, but because, like him, everyone would listen, everyone would hear the whisper, and when that happens, there would be no solid ground. One morning, during an unexplained blackout in the north wing of the asylum, the security systems were down for 11 minutes. No alarms went off. No cameras recorded what happened. But when the nurses resumed their rounds, they found Thomas's cell open, the lock intact, the door just ajar. Inside, there were no signs of a struggle, no signs of escape. The bed was made. The patient's clothing was neatly folded on the mattress. On the floor, a single drawing made in water, as if someone had dipped their fingers in it and traced the shape calmly and methodically. The spiral, but no ordinary spiral. This one was made of waves, shells, eyes and tentacles that intertwined toward the center. And in the center, the outline of two faces, almost united in a kiss. Thomas Gray was never seen again. No body was found. No footprints outside the cell. The official report concluded disappearance due to institutional collapse, a technical term used when those in charge don't know what to write. But Dr. Holloway, he knew. He never went to sleep without hearing the sound of the ocean again, even though he lived dozens of miles from the coast. Weeks later, strange news began to circulate in regional newspapers. A group of recreational divers had disappeared near the reefs of the channel. Fishermen reported seeing a tower that was not shown on maps, visible only when the tide was at a certain point. A girl in Cornwall woke up from a nightmare and drew, without ever having learned, the same spiral as Thomas. Her grandmother fainted upon seeing it, for she recognized the symbol carved into the stone of a village where she had spent her childhood, a village that she said had sunk decades ago. Experts dismissed it. They attributed it to collective mental phenomena, subconscious cultural echo, or isolated hoaxes. But in certain occult circles, the name began to be whispered again, Inthaleg. And on some moonless nights, when the sea recedes beyond its usual depths, a few souls swear they hear a song that mixes lamentation and promise. A female voice, young, longing, the voice of someone who loves but has not forgotten what she must do. Eleanor, now merged into the background, had become something more. She was no longer a bride nor a victim. She was a guardian. A sentinel of flesh and ocean, made of all the memories that humanity had drowned out of fear. In her eyes, dozens of them, lived the memory of Thomas. She still loved him, and so she still hesitated. Intellect's full awakening depended on her, but part of her heart, if she still had one, remained attached to that padded cell, to that interrupted kiss, to that voice that called her name from the top of the lighthouse. At the bottom of the canal, under tons of rocks, shells and silences, Eleanor sang. She sang not to invoke, but to remember. And each note was an invisible thread that spread through the waters of the world. Some listened, Others dreamed, and few, very few, understood, because love, even in the abyss, is still a language that touches everything. At the asylum, cell 43 was permanently closed. Many said it was superstition, but the corridors around it began to accumulate unexplained moisture. Fungus grew even under intense cleaning, and on nights when the new moon coincided with high tide, staff reported hearing a whisper, not screams, not moans, but tender, sweet words spoken with the softness of a final goodbye. I didn't come back, but I still love you. And that was always how the silence ended. And that was always how the sea far away, somewhere that the maps forgot, would start moving again. If you liked this story, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future content. See you later.